can't hear you, Richard.
I at least don't hear your audio.
How about now? That looks better. See the little audio level indicators. Am I audible for folks?
Yes.
That's good to me.
Good morning. Richard just wanted a sound check, so good morning, good afternoon. I think morning for, well, at least for everyone in the US. Can you hear me, Richard, or no?
I can hear you, Kathleen.
Thank you. All right, well, maybe we switch how we're gonna run this.
Yeah, I guess we can get started, and when Richard manages to solve his problems with the audio, we can let him take the reins. Oh, okay. One more.
Blessed with
I think I'm resolved with
temporarily 4
bidirectional audio
chairs
now.
this time.
Richard Mohit, could you say something so I can confirm that?
Check, mic check.
Wow, I think my audio is working in whatever not full duplex is half duplex. I can only listen when I'm not speaking.
Anyhow, so
yeah, Mohit, if you could get the session started, I'll continue to fiddle with this and see if I can get it patched up.
no worries. So yeah, as I was saying, new chair. So hello everyone. Let's let Richard solve his problems. We can start the session. So this is SECDISPATCH. Next slide. I'm sure by Thursday you're familiar with the note well, but if you're not, please read through this. Let's give it a minute. Hopefully you're familiar with all this by now. Okay, yeah. So this is an online meeting, and you are being recorded. This will show up on YouTube later. So hope that's fine with you. Next slide. So here are some relevant links. So hopefully you are joined into the meeting with Meet Echo. We are taking notes in CodeMD. The slides are posted in Data Tracker. And this working group is about dispatching items and not really adopting drafts. So when you do give feedback, try to also give feedback on the fact how to dispatch this work item, whether it should be AD adopted or whether there should be a new working group, and so on. Next slide. Yeah, I guess this slide kind of emphasizes that. So it recommends the next steps and does not adopt drafts. So there are several possibilities. It can go to some existing working group or start a new working group, or then you can arm twist the ADs into sponsoring documents if you feel that's the appropriate step. And there's always the possibility where you think that IETF should not work on this topic because it is completely out of scope. All right, next slide. Thanks to Francesca who has prepared this. So hopefully you're familiar with these buttons by now, but if not, this hand is to join the queue, and you can unmute yourself and show your video, and hopefully you won't need to share your screen, but we might run some polls later. So hopefully you know how to raise your hands by now. Next slide. So this is our agenda. I guess we are still on time with the admin trivia. Is still 10 minutes. Does anyone want to bash the agenda? Is there some new items that should be there?
Francesca, I see you're in queue.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, just highlight the fact that this is my last meeting as SecDispatch chair. So I want to thank everybody. And I want to thank Mohit for coming in and taking the job, and I'm sure he will do great. I don't know if our ADs want to say something.
Francesca, you jumped the gun there. I was going to wait until Mohit had finished the chair slides. And then, thank you for your service as SecDispatch co-chair, and welcome Mohit to the crowd. We are a bit unique at the moment in having 4 co-chairs, as an AD pointed out to me in the back channel. I promise we are going to be reducing that number imminently. But I think we're tremendously thankful to Francesca for your help here, and looking forward to working with Mohit going forward. Roman, you had a comment?
I also want to thank Francesca too. She did a lot of the heavy lifting for us for the last few meetings. It's really very much appreciated, and wish you the best of luck as you become an AD. Congratulations.
Likewise, and I wanted to repeat that, Francesca, thank you for all your help with SecDispatch, and I look forward to being with you on the IESG, and welcome to Mohit. Thank you so much for kind of stepping up for one of our more diverse working groups.
Mohit, I guess I have to warn you that being appointed to the IESG is apparently an occupational hazard of being SecDispatch co-chair. So look forward to your standing for that next time around.
Well, I have big shoes to fill, so thank you, Francesca. As you can see, she still prepared the slides, and she's still sharing the slides from her laptop. So yeah, she has been doing a lot of the heavy lifting even for this meeting. So thanks a lot, and good luck with the IESG.
Thank you. Thank you.
Richard, you can take the reins, so I'll stay quiet now.
All right, I think we're starting into our agenda now. I think this is the last of the chair slides. Is there one more of these? I think this is the last. So I think my only job here is to hand it over to Martin.
You want to state the rules of how we run through?
Oh, all right. Sorry, I'd forgotten. Do we have that in the remainder? Just a reminder of folks that this is dispatch. This is not a working group. And so we are focused on those dispatch outcomes. What should we do with this work? Should we send it to an existing working group, start up another working group, recommend to the ADs that the AD sponsor it, or tell it to go away? We're not going to do any work on this. So as you're listening to these presentations, please keep those outcomes in mind, because that's the discussion we're going to have when the presentations are done, and try and come to a conclusion as to what we should do with this work. So with that, Martin, please take it on.
Thanks, Richard. So yes, I will give an overview of what this is. I think there's been a bit of discussion about that and some confusion. We do have an updated version of the draft, I think, that has addressed some of those things since the discussion, but I'll make sure that everyone understands the same thing. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right, so what this is I use system and method here, for making unlinkable HTTP requests. And one of the things we're trying to get to is a system whereby servers that gather information about requests aren't able to do things to build profiles of the people making those requests and use that for reasons. So there's 2 parts to this. We have a proxy that hides all of the source addressing and the request information that we don't want the server to see, and an additional layer of encryption to ensure that that proxy doesn't get to see the contents of requests and responses, which is kind of the most sensitive information that there is. So it's all about information separation, a simple mixed net. Next, please. So how this works, it's pretty simple. The server publishes an HPKE configuration. The client makes a fresh context for every request, encapsulates it, sends it via the proxy. The server unbundles that information, gets the request and processes it, encapsulates a response using the context and some does some computations based on the context. And we have to use HPKE exporters to get the keying material, but the response is encapsulated and sent back via the proxy. The client can then remove that extra layer of protection to get its response. In and out. Next slide, please. So why you would want to do this? So there are a lot of contexts in which there's information contained in requests that, if linked together in a series, might provide the server with information that maybe clients don't want them to have. Big discussion that we've had in the DNS groups has been about oblivious DNS, and obviously the name here is a nod to the original name that was given to the oblivious DNS system. This is largely based on that work. The main use case here that we imagine would be something where we make DNS queries using something like DO, and you can use this to encapsulate those queries and protect the sequence of queries that you make, and telemetry queries. And what's unique about these ones, sorry, I should expand on that one. Telemetry submission for something like this, we maintain in Firefox a telemetry system where we would like to know information about what people's clients are doing, but we don't really want to connect that information with the people. There's nothing really that we gain from having that, except for access to what is essentially toxic information. So we'll be looking to do things like that for telemetry. And what's also unique about these is that there is no real need to carry information from one request to the next in series. There is value, however, in breaking them into discrete units. The advantages of something like this is that it has less overhead than some of the alternatives that we have available to us. So if we look at doing regular HTTP proxying, there's no protocol changes in order to get something like that working, but it requires that you make a new connection for every single request via the proxy. So you have a connection to the proxy, and then you make a new request for every new connection for every request to the server that you make. That has a lot of overhead, round trips in particular. Tor, again, is much stronger. You can do that same sort of thing as with a proxy, except that now you've got the full multi-layer mixnet involved, and that's much higher overheads in terms of latency and also cryptographic and whatnot. And then there's systems like Prio, which work for telemetry submissions, where you can make information about the what's going on available to people in an aggregated fashion, but you don't get any responsiveness and things like that. So the advantages of something like this is that you get much greater performance in terms of latency over a system like Prio. Next, please. All right, so why not? There's plenty of reasons why this doesn't really work for all sorts of use cases. This is not general purpose HTTP in the sense that you don't carry state between requests. And that means cookies on one hand, which some people might go, yes, that's a great thing. But it also means that you can't do things like follow links, because links carry state between requests. And so the general pattern of use of HTTP for things like web browsing doesn't really apply in this case. It's also a lot more expensive to make requests this way. And if you don't have any basis for trust in the parties that are involved in this one, so in particular, if you can't arrange a situation where a server trusts a proxy or the user trusts the proxy to the extent that they need to be trusted, then this doesn't work. And that's where you might want to go to things like Tor, where those requirements for trust are much lower. Next, please. So if we look at the performance characteristics of this, when we compare it to the very simple scenario that's most like this, which is the one request per connection through a proxy, it's quite favorable. If if you look at the overheads involved. And so when we look at this, we say that we're trading some of the security advantages perhaps for performance. So there are some replay protection things that are not quite as good in this system, and post-compromise security is not as great. But you can do things like reduce the number of cryptographic operations that are involved. And probably the killer one for us is that you reduce the number of round trips involved. There's also some byte level savings in terms of making sure that requests are much smaller. I put some numbers here, but those are absolute minimums. There's a bunch of extra wrapping that's involved that probably pushes that up quite a lot more. Next, please. So yes, I mentioned the trust thing before. The idea here is that there is a limited amount of trust in the system that's required. The proxy has to be trusted by the client not to leak their identity to the server, and the server has to trust the proxy not to abuse its position to create denial of service attacks and overload. There's a bunch of things that you might need to do in order to get better traffic analysis resistance. And the nature of the system is that replay attacks are possible if the proxy wishes to act in a bad fashion. So there's either a requirement for trust or a set of protections you put in place to ensure that replay attacks aren't possible. And we can reuse some of the anti-replay mechanisms that we've used for zero RTT in TLS, but not all of those. And also, probably the worst one is that if the server keys, which are static, are compromised, all of the messages can be read if the proxy makes those messages available to an attacker. It does require, again, that I guess the trust level in the proxy that is somewhat higher than the baseline. Next, please. In order to make this work, we could probably get this working by reusing the existing definition for message HTTP. There's a number of reasons why that would be awkward. It has some fairly difficult implementation characteristics, including some awkward stateful characteristics. You have to understand the request in order to make sense of the response in a lot of cases. So as part of this, we've got a short draft that describes a simple binary encoding for HTTP messages that allows you to make those reasonably efficiently. It doesn't do any of the fancy features that HTTP3 does. It doesn't do header compression and various other things like that. And the only flexibility is to allow for streaming processing, which is a common use case in a lot of these things. But even that's negotiable. Next, please. I think, yes, this is the question that we're here to ask now. It's relatively small and largely self-contained specification there. There's a couple of opportunities that we have for doing things like discovery of the various actors involved and advertising formats and whatnot, but the core of the specification isn't really that much. It took not very long to implement, as Chris and I will both attest. We have implementations, they interoperate. There's a test client and server that people can play with if they so choose. So the question would be, is there interest in doing the work? Is there enough people willing to do the work? And where do you think it'd be best to do the work? I've got some ideas. I'm suggesting here a working group, but the question for the group will be to answer that question based on your own. Oh, I see we have a list.
Run through with Rich first and try to keep your questions brief, just in the interest of keeping to time.
Sure. Nice haircut, Martin. I'm jealous. How does this relate, Rich Salzakamai? Have you looked at the Chrome anonymous prefetch stuff? I'll post a link in the chat, and I wonder
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
have, if it's
This does relate to that. Yeah, thanks, Richard. There's a bunch of things in this space that do relate to the to this general area of work whereby you have the ability to fetch things more or less anonymously, and this does give you some of that ability. This doesn't have necessarily the right set of guarantees for that work because of the unlinkability properties that we have here. It's not particularly well suited to doing things like stateful prefetching things, particularly when you think about prefetching an entire web page, which might include multiple requests, multiple resources. So I do think it is adjacent, but not entirely the same. I think it's David now.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks for the presentation, Martin. I think this is a really cool tool. I think it complements nicely a lot of the other tools we're building in Mask and other places at the IETF. I think this fits a different use case, which is great. So I would be very much in favor of us working on this at the IETF. And I think your proposal of a short-lived, small, specific, well, narrowly focused working group is the right one. So I would advocate for that as well.
I was waiting for Kathleen to introduce the next person in the queue, and then I realized it was me. So I think I have a couple of concerns about this. Mainly, I'd like to understand better sort of concerns. One is this distinction between applications of HTTP for which this makes sense and for which it doesn't make sense, which you seem to draw there. I wonder if there's how sharply we can draw that line. And the other concern I have is that there seems to be kind of a collection of intermediation strategies being adopted around IETF nowadays. And it seems like it would be good to do a little bit of work to collate those and understand what's good where. So like I would contrast, there's the oblivious DNS stuff. I understand some work being done on multi-layered masks, so you can tunnel quick tunnels, stack quick tunnels. So I mean, and then of course there's all the legacy of Tor work and the protocols they've got there. So it seems like some degree of housekeeping would be useful in terms of having an understandable, comprehensible tool set for folks. So I didn't know if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, I think to your first point, the distinction between sort of the continuous use of HTTP with context, the representational state transfer, or cookies, or whatever you have, the highfalutin version, or the thing that everyone uses, is very different from this, and this imagines a more atomic style of interaction, which is well suited to things like the DNS case or the telemetry submission.
The question I'm wondering is, is there a technical, clearly defined line one could draw to put a bounding box around this and say it's safe?
Yeah, and so that's what I was thinking. That when it comes down to this general strategy of intermediation for this, I think we're kind of reaching the point now where we're using this intermediation strategy for privacy purposes, for a number of different purposes, and having the spread in the toolkit is starting to become necessary. I do think that you're right in identifying the pattern and being deliberate about our choices in selecting from this space. But I think this is an underserved point in that space at the moment. And so we're seeing this with the oblivious DNS and the oblivious DO and things like that. And one of the things I was trying to do was find something that was generic, that would be able to be applied across a number of different things, rather than look for the point solutions that we've had in the case of Tommy's oblivious DNS or oblivious DO proposal. I think that's something that I was uncomfortable with for the reasons that you stated. Yeah. Thanks, Rich.
And finally, I'd just like to read in some comments that I got from Matthew Finkel of the Tor project on back channel. He says that he is generally supportive. Tor might not use it directly, but it could be something they could leverage to reduce some of their constraints, maybe allow them to get away with one less hop, less latency, et cetera. So some support there for doing the work from Tor project.
Great. That's surprising,
Right.
but good.
I will yield the floor to Tommy.
All right, thanks for presenting this. So I'm definitely supportive of this. I think of the options, having a short-lived working group, I think is the right solution. There's enough conversation to have around this. I also appreciate what Richard was saying about kind of pointing us to like the other solutions and how do we rationalize that. I agree that this is kind of one of the tools in the toolbox that we can use. And I think having a working group for this would complement well the work that's going on in Mask, because I essentially see the Mask proxying as ways, improving the ways we have more stateful, long-lived proxy connections for privacy. And this solution covers all of the less stateful things that are more just transactional one-off. And so if you put those two together, I think you have a relatively complete toolbox. And I would actually hope that in deployments, the actual nodes that are proxies support both. That essentially a proxy would have some connections that it's doing connect UDP for long-lived things that the client wants, and everything else that's transactional like DNS and stats reporting goes through an OHTTP solution. So I don't know where that kind of architectural rationalization of how we put all the pieces together lives, if we need to really specify that, but having a group to look at this particular building block would be really good.
Okay, so I don't think that was quite a question, but a helpful statement. Daniel?
Yeah, hi. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh yeah, good. So I was wondering, so if we have the proxy and the end server, I'm just wondering, in your scenarios, are they managed by the same entity, or are they managed by different independent entities?
Yeah, so presumably the client and server are operated by different entities, and the proxy has to be, from the client's perspective, a different entity to the server, primarily because they have to trust that one won't be passing information to the other. And usually find that the best way to achieve that is to make sure that they have some sort of incentive aligned in that way, and being a different organization is usually the best way to do that. There's discussion of this in the draft.
Okay, but in your deployment, is it the ISP, for example, that is deploying the proxy, or?
So in the trial we're doing with a related thing, which is for the DNS thing, there are independent people, not the ISP, but there certainly could be, and I imagine, but there's an independent party running the proxy, completely independent of either us or the server operator.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Okay, and now Edgar.
Thanks for the presentation, Martin. I don't think anybody would be surprised to hear I'm in favor of this. Anytime I can encrypt anything, people know I love that. I think a short-lived working group is the right answer. I know there's some questions about the relationship between this and Odo. I think just to mention what was in the chat, I think it's a clear generalization of Odo. Whether I think eventually we do, Odo will be OHTTP. There's why I hear from talking like Tommy and Chris and others. So I think the question we have to resolve would be, is Odo proceed in parallel, is experimental, or is it just wait on this? And that would depend on how long we thought it would take to get this done. But I think there's not a conflict. I think if it's probably everybody's working together.
Yeah, my intent was certainly that this be used for Odo, but if it turns out that we can't make that work, or something happens that means that we need to move faster on that, then obviously we can work that out.
And Kirsty Payne.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on some of the replay attacks and the sort of security model that you're operating on in here. And you've already mentioned that you have to put a lot of trust in the proxy, that you expect the client to need to really put quite a bit of trust in the proxy. Couple of questions in the specification. It mentions that like co-location of the request resource and the target resource like simplifies kind of interactions. But to like what extent do you technically mitigate this kind of independence from the server, and to what extent are you expecting it to be done on like a out of technical scope? So you're just hoping that the client designates the proxy in like a policy way rather than a technical sense of trust.
Right. Yeah, so that's a good question. So the draft actually specifies 4 different functions, but imagines that 2 of those functions, the target resource and the thing that's removing the encryption, which is the request resource, are actually operated by the same entity in a lot of cases, and so it's the interaction between the server operator and the proxy operator that are most interesting to the client, and those are the ones that need to be separate entities. So when I say server, I mean those 2 things that are together in the same place. When you say a lot of trust, I don't think this is a lot of trust, but it does require some degree of trust. And so what we had imagined is a range of things, whether that be contractual, and so enforced by some system, but there's also the possibility to have audits or any other sort of system in place to ensure that the proxy maintains the level of trust that we require of it, which is mostly that it doesn't pass client information or information about client identity specifically to the server.
Yeah, I guess when I say a lot of trust is just, you mentioned like the need to avoid, like if the proxy abuses its position, you can end up with overload, you can have replay attacks if the proxy chooses to act in a bad fashion. And so it would be helpful to know if you plan to like have a technical mitigation for that, or if the trust is kind of, yeah, out of scope and it's just going to be determined on a policy basis.
Yeah, so you mentioned a number of things. The overload stuff is something we're continuing to work on, but ultimately it's likely to come down to those sorts of non-technical constraints, in my opinion at least. Others may differ. The replay stuff does have technical mitigations, but that's going to depend on the application building those. As a generic toolkit, I don't think we can provide anything generic. We can only provide hooks. And I see Ekka's there.
Yeah, so I think it's probably worth trying to frame this question of how much you have to trust the proxy a little bit. So I think there probably are, and the first thing to recognize is that in many cases this is a replacement for existing situations where the client would connect directly to the server. So in the case of like Odo, right, the client would be connected to the server ordinarily. And so like from the client's perspective, like anything is like, so, even if the proxy defects situation is no worse than if this hadn't been deployed. So now certainly that once you have this in place, there will be situations in which you might want to use it that you weren't prepared to do anything at all. In that case, you will of course have to trust the proxy and the server not to collaborate. I think the more interesting questions are what the situation is for the server and what it has to expect from the proxy. The anti-replay stuff obviously is an issue. Note the anti-replays are not an issue on the client. The client has built-in anti-replay. It's only the server which does a replay. This is like, think about this like TLS0RTT or like sending S5 messages around. So the questions are partly like this question of replay. There's questions about overload. And I think that that the reason that overload is an issue is not because the proxy has superpowers, but because the ordinary anti-DOS mitigations that the server would apply, which look like IP address reputation, won't work properly because everything mostly comes from the proxy. So there are mechanisms for preventing that, but yes, typically you have to assume that the proxy isn't DOSing you. If the proxy is DOSing you, you basically have like one giant handle you can turn where you're like, I don't let the proxy connect to me anymore. And so the proxy has a strong incentive not to cheat here, because the proxy does cheat, then what happens is all the people behind them get cut off. So I don't think I don't think that's like something I'm too worried operationally. I know this is a bunch of chat here about about like, are we reconstructing Tor? I think actually when we're reconstructing here Mixmaster more than Tor. So typically there are two anonymity kind of things. There's like high latency mixed networks, and there's like things like Tor. I think the mass tunneling is actually more like Tor. I think I also would be in favor of like trying to like have several anonymity networks for different latency trade-off points. But I think that like I don't think that like if we wanted to take Tor on at some point, this would not get in the way of that.
Jonathan.
And Jonathan.
Yeah, so I just have the queue after Jonathan.
Just on the point about the replay attacks, it seems like if I'm understanding this properly, cases like DNS, replay attacks are not a consideration because they're idempotent requests anyway. Is that true, or am I missing something? So it could be that your solution to replay attacks is for this use case, I don't care.
That is going to be the case for a lot of these scenarios. So if you imagine this is simple information retrieval, which is what DNS is, then your response might well be, I don't care. It's a little more interesting when it comes to things like telemetry submission. You have to have a structure in place to ensure that a replay doesn't result in multiple submissions, but those are relatively straightforward to build for things like that. It does sort of limit what you can do with the mechanism, though. All right.
Okay, thank you. So the chat has been very active. It seems like there's quite a bit of support for this to move forward as a short-lived, and yes, there's lots of comments on short-lived working groups in the IETF. Let's assume a short-lived working group, and the home would be determined by the ADs because there will have to be some coordination between Sec, Int, and Art. I'm just going to run a quick poll to see if anyone's opposed. So we'll give you a minute.
Is raised hand opposed?
Yes, raised hand is opposed.
This is very confusingly worded. I recommend wording all polls in the positive sense.
Because I raised hand because
I had started doing it in the positive, and then the chairs behind the scenes said, let's just see if there's opposition. Because it seems pretty unanimous. All right, so I'll let this run just a little bit longer.
While that's running, well.
As opposed, I'd like to hear what I'd be happy if they're up for talking about it. I'd be happy to hear why.
Okay, so it seems there are 2 people opposed. I will end the poll, and then I agree it would be good to hear.
So we do have someone in queue.
Kirsty, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just waiting to be invited. Yeah, I was just wondering if it's a short-lived working group, but that would come with a BOF of like deciding what's in and out of scope for the group. I personally don't feel like I have a good enough sense of it, like how much is in and out of scope for this problem. If it is a really tightly scoped, we're not going to talk about discovery of proxies or anything like that, and it's just standardizing the protocol rather than any of that other stuff. So it's just a question if that's included in support for a short-lived working group, but it would be like a discussion about charter and scope.
Yeah, I think what I had in mind was the tight scope that Martin had on his last slide, just focusing on the protocol as opposed to all the discovery aspects and how you would instantiate this. And I was thinking we would workshop the charter on the SecDispatch mailing list to give people a chance to comment on that before we send it out for last call and finalization. I would also throw in as a scoping question whether we might want to include a deliverable of some sort of like systematization document talking about some of these security properties. You know, what happens depending on your selection? How does this how does this relate to other intermediation protocols, things like that? But that's not at all clear that belongs in scope. So I'm happy to debate that on the mailing list.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the clarification. I think that sounds like a good suggestion to me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other
Thank you.
concerns with that outcome?
Hi, so I'm just jumping on to confirm that Ben and I have caught the action. We're going to coordinate with the other areas to figure out what the right formula is to mix what area with what responsible AD with what composition of the working group chairs to make sure we get the right cross-area oversight, because I think that's absolutely kind of the right thing to do, and we saw a lot of discussion about that in the chat. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to everyone for your input. I think we can consider that one dispatched, and thank you, Martin, for the presentation. So with that, I think we are done with our first topic of the meeting, and we are on to Yaron, talking about a common ciphertext format.
Thank you, Richard. I do assume you can hear me.
Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm Yaron Sheffer. This is joint work with Gleb Kesselman and Yoav Nir. And this is a proposal for a generic ciphertext metadata format. And if you remember anything out of this is that we're talking about data encrypted at rest. So we're not talking about data on the wire, unlike most encryption work in the IETF. We're talking about encryption at rest. Next slide. Thank you. So documents that define encryption or ciphers or algorithms often define the format of the output. That's clear and simple, but that's the bare minimum. It's not what you need if you are to manage huge amounts of ciphertext stored at rest, basically all over your data stores, stored in databases, stored in data lakes, stored in the data marts and all sorts of places where people keep data, including sensitive data. And the point to remember is that we actually have three personas, not just whoever creates and encrypts the data and whoever decrypts the data, that's clear. But we also have a third persona, which is a suite of data governance tools. People who manage data at scale need to have tools for that, and we'll go into details in the next slide. But to enable to manage encrypted data, we will need to define ciphertext metadata that can be handled by multiple tools. And so the basic thing you need is a key identity and probably a key version, just so that you can go back and decrypt the data. But this needs to be extensible. People have different requirements when encrypting data at scale. People, for example, apply key wrapping and key derivation, and those require additional information that's often stored with a ciphertext. So all of that accumulates, all of that needs to be interoperable. All of that needs to be efficient because we are talking large amounts of data. So even though storage is cheap nowadays, this becomes expensive as it accumulates. And what we need to enable is both detection and attribution of ciphertext. And on the next slide, please. I will explain what we mean by detection and attribution. So typically, when you manage such amounts of data, you need to scan the data regularly. People classify the data. Big enterprises often have classification schemes, what is more sensitive, what is less sensitive, and they want to find out if misclassified data is making its way to data stores where it doesn't belong. People want to look at data and check for data quality. So whether data is in line with internal data models or just using the right formats that are used across the enterprise. And often it's really important specifically to detect PII. So, or personally identifiable information, so sensitive data. Now, when you scan data at a very large scale and a large percentage or a significant percentage is encrypted, the basic requirement is that you can with a high probability detect what is encrypted. So you need to have a format that can be recognized across the enterprise or across the data store, so that you know what data is encrypted, and then you want to have the next step. Like which key management system is responsible for this data, or perhaps what specific key has been used for this data to go, so that if the data needs to be decrypted, it can be acted upon. But even before decryption, the two requirements are to detect and identify encrypted data and to attribute data back to who owns it. So that again, if data access needs to be granted, the person who is looking or the tool that's looking at the data can know who owns the data and who is responsible to grant access into the encrypted data. Next slide. So we started with this set of requirements and ended up with a rather simple header format that we propose to use for CIPHERTEXT, and it consists of a very short 2 by 2 octet fixed header followed by a variable length additional header that's expressed as CBOR. We started off with generic TLV, then we got the feedback that instead of reinventing TLV and various ways of optimizing and improving on TLV, why not just use CBOR? And obviously that's the right thing to do. So the current version 01 uses CBOR, and on the next slide, some more details of what this CBOR is. So next slide, please. We are using the CDDL definition language, but never mind the language itself. I think even if you're not familiar with CDDL, it's quite clear what we have here. So we have two data items that are mandatory. the key provider and the key ID. One is an unsigned integer, one is a byte string, and this is followed by a collection of other either integer or byte string attributes. The two mandatory fields, obviously the most important, are what is the key management system that owns the key, or who should I go to ask for more details about this piece of data, and then a key identity that you can hand over to this key management system, and it will do its thing. And then additional details that you might want to have is a key version number, which is the simplest way to enable key rotation on data at rest, auxiliary data that you can use for either key derivation or key wrapping, and three fields that are useful when you're doing AEAD for the data at rest. So again, the format is 2 octets followed by a very simple TLV structure, simple yet flexible and also extensible. And the reason why this actually needs to be standardized, if it wasn't clear, is that often large enterprises use key management coming from different vendors, different cloud providers, and then there are different encryption libraries coming from here and there. And the more we can have it standardized, the more we can streamline management of very diverse and complicated data stores. Next slide. So speaking of implementations, my own company, Intuit, implements a similar format internally, not specifically the one we specify here, but a similar one, and we have been using it for very, very significant amounts of data across the enterprise. And then just 2 examples of cloud providers that define their own encryption or ciphertext formats are Amazon Web Services and Google, each defining its own format that's somewhat similar if you squint to this format, but obviously not interoperable. And so I think that that shows that the need exists, and I suggest that we take it on. And so what we would like to see is a very narrow scoped working group to take on this work, working very specifically on the format and nothing else. And that's it. I'll take questions.
All right, Watson.
Watson Lad, Cloudflare. This seems like a XCCD 927 issue. If all these incompatible formats, now you're saying, okay, we'll just make one format to unify them all that does a bunch of things for each one. Why isn't that just going to lead to, okay, there's another format and it's incompatible with all the others and people haven't switched to it?
It could just, just like any other standard, of course. If it's good enough, if it's useful enough, hopefully it will be taken on. Echo.
So I'm also confused. It seems to me we have like already formats that like allow you to encrypt things with fixed keys and allow you to have identities for those keys and describe the algorithms. Like Jose is one such one, as is Jose, as for instance the CMS. So like I guess I don't quite understand what what are we bringing to the party here? What does it bring to the party?
So both COSA and certainly CMS are aimed at a different use case. Here we put a very strong focus on efficiency for data at rest, where each piece of data needs to be handled separately. And so every byte counts. I don't think this is true to this extent for COSA. COSA was envisioned or is envisioned as a solution for data in transit and has different set of requirements.
Okay, well then I think the place to start would be not with a proposal, but with an enumeration of the requirements and how existing conclusions don't meet them. But I will say that when I hear like things are too big, I'm automatically suspicious until I see some very strong evidence that like the thing is the overhead we're talking is really too big. Your average when things are encrypted, like the auth tags out a lot of data, out a lot of space, the nonce out a lot of space, like. As a practical matter, I'm not persuaded that the overhead of cozy wrapping is going to be too big. Until I saw that, I would not be in favor of this. More strictly, does it? On a technical question, does something bind this header to the content?
So that's a very good question. Our current thinking is no, but we'll leave it open, and this is something that the working group will need to decide on, whether it's mandatory, whether it's per data item, and so on.
Right. Well, this seems like a great opportunity to remake all the errors that people made with previous formats. So anyway, this is a dispatch question, dispatch question. I don't think we should do this. We'll have a lot more evidence.
This is Daniel Gilmore with the ACLU, also co-chair of the OpenPGP working group. Just wanted to add to the list of standards that this seems to potentially duplicate, which includes OpenPGP, which is actually designed for data at rest, not just data in transit. So again, the gap analysis would be useful if this is actually being proposed for work. I also want to put a bit of a challenge to one of the proposed justifications here. The claim that we need to tag data that is PII versus not PII, I find that dubious. I think the whole term PII is actually pretty dubious because information is personally identifiable in combination with other pieces of information, and that's incredibly difficult to determine even when you have clear text. I don't think that a simple flag on the outside of a ciphertext packet is sufficient to be able to track that sort of thing. And so I'm also, similarly to Ecker before, very dubious about the usefulness of this work and its ability to accomplish the stated goals. So I would move towards not putting this into the IETF unless we have a much clearer understanding of what it's trying to do and how it's going to actually do it.
So to clarify, I wasn't proposing to tag information as PII. I was just giving it as yet another reason why people are continuously scanning data at a very large scale, and therefore data needs to be, encrypted data needs to be detectable and attributable.
So, but I think that's not quite clear from your presentation. It seemed to suggest that because people want to know what data is PII or not, they want to be able to index the data, which in turn actually creates more additional trails of identifiable information. It seems a little bit like you are reintroducing the problem that it claims to solve if the goal is protecting from person identifiable data being leaked in certain places, right? You're basically adding PII to the outside of the packet.
Yeah, So again, no, I'm not proposing to tag PII or to add PII on the outside of the encrypted data. Please don't call it a packet. It is not. But I mean, a complete discussion of why people are scanning data, what it's useful for, is very interesting, but it's very much outside of the scope of this discussion, or in fact, the scope of the proposal.
Hi, David Skenazy. First, I want to slightly echo what people have said before, but additionally, it sounds like the problem that you want to solve has already been solved before. There appear to be open source projects that have solved this to some extent. And I'm not seeing what the role of the IETF is here. Like, this isn't a networking protocol, this is a file format. And I'm not seeing folks like who already have, let's say, their own formats lining up to say we need something new. So unless we really have proof that there is interest from the community here, and additionally proof that this fits into the charter of the IETF, which I'm not seeing, I don't think we should move forward with this. I would love to see those points elaborated on first.
Yeah, so just regarding scope, IETF has been doing a lot of work that's not directly network related. I don't think we can say that JSON is network related unless we squint very, very hard. So yeah. Phil?
Yeah, I was going to say almost more of the same. A constant anti-pattern that I see in standards development is people say, there are 6 of those, let's standardize them and create a 7th. Another anti-pattern is, and we want to focus on just this set of concerns. And I think that's the anti-pattern I'm seeing there, the combination of those two, in that this is a very point solution to the problem of encryption. And I don't think that it can hope to meet a wide range of stuff. You know, we've got things like PKS7 that address the problem in the large already. And I don't see how adding another solution that only addresses one particular niche set of requirements where you want is relevant. And in the days when I've got 90 terabytes of disks sitting next to me, I'm getting really skeptical about arguments of we've got to compress every byte, and therefore we need a new standard. I mean, like, I cannot believe that in the time it takes this specification to come out, that you won't have a disk drive that can hold a kilobyte for every person on the population of the planet. So I really just don't get those arguments at all. Sorry.
So Cozy, thank you, Phil. Right. Cozy is out there, and people are not using Cozy, or at least we are seeing people who are not using Cozy and are doing their own. So obviously, the outcomes, the deliverables of the IETF are not addressing this problem.
Yeah, but so I'm going to do my own regardless of whether IETF has a spec. I mean, like, I don't use Cozy in my work. I never read the Cozy spec because it doesn't address my problems. I've got a different set of problems, and it is easier for me to generate a new specification that actually meets my needs than to reuse, and I don't see an advantage of the reuse. So this is a specification that if you put it in place, it only becomes an obstacle to my work because I have to explain to people why I'm not going to be doing it. And the reason is because it's answering a set of requirements that don't apply to my stuff at all.
This is Kathleen without a chair hat on. I am curious to hear more on the use cases. Just thinking, you know, I recently left Dell EMC and was there a long time. So, you know, seeing that there is someone from Dell on there, we have someone from AWS. We're thinking about these problems. I'd want to know, is this working towards some multi-cloud type solution for compatibility? You know, how might this be used in the long term? Is it going to help customers who do have multi-cloud deployment so that they have some consistency? Like, you know, what's the use case in the end game, and just more descriptions along that. So maybe a mailing list.
Will do. Multi-cloud is absolutely something we have in mind. I think long-term enterprises will be on multi-cloud and will need such solutions to be able to manage this big mess of data coming from different directions.
That's helpful.
All right, I think we have trained the queue. So looking at the discussion here and the discussion on Jabber, it sounds like folks think we need a little bit more precision on the requirements, and especially kind of gap analysis vis-a-vis the current solutions that are out there, things like COSE in particular. So I think that I would propose the dispatch outcome here be kind of no concrete action, further discussion needed. I think we can have that discussion either on the dispatch list or a new mailing list if folks want to have a focused venue for this. Does that sound about right to people? Open the floor for feedback on that outcome. All right.
So I think the spirit of this process is that we should specify what would be required, roughly speaking, for it to proceed beyond a mailing list. And I think what we heard was like a real gap analysis of why the current solutions don't do it, and some evidence that there are people who would actually deploy this technology.
I think those are the right questions, yeah, or the right deliverables for this discussion.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks for the presentation, Yaron. All right, now we are on to our third topic, which is Rich Saul's to talk about usage of subject alt name in certificates. Rich, I don't think you are audible. I'm getting video from you, but not audio. Hopefully it's not my problem this time.
No, it's not. I can't hear you, Rich, either.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Talaya.
Here you go.
All right.
Go ahead.
So, no slides. You can look at the text or the dinosaur behind my head. RFC 6125 is 10 plus years old. At the time it said, oh, we shouldn't use the common name field to identify, servers anymore. The industry has moved forward. Nobody really uses the common name, except they have to because nobody has said, don't use the common name. Comment in the chat there says, should this have been called CN die? Yeah, but well, die should die. So it's a joke's played out. So anyhow, 6125 was AD standard, AD sponsored. I don't care where this goes. I would rather not. I saw some discussion on the mailing list about increasing, doing more. but I'd rather keep this pretty simple. That's it.
All right, folks have comments. DKG, you have echo.
Hi, Rich.
Hey.
I'm sorry, I'm getting an echo, I think through, I don't know who. Now I'm not. So I apologize for not having read this draft, but could you speak a little bit to how this applies to non-TLS uses of X509, in particular SMIME, where I believe the common name is typically used to identify the person's natural name?
Sure. I think as with 6125, it only talks about TLS use.
That'd be great to put that in the abstract.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hello, Valery Smyslov, Utah co-chair. Well, I think this draft can be worked on in Utah, but I agree with DKG that some clarification is needed in the text, that the draft is talking about TLS, because currently TLS is not mentioned at all in the draft except for reference to RFC 6125. And when I first read it, my first impression was that it's a very generic approach, as it can be get rid of common name from distinguished name and certificate that can be applied for an arbitrary security protocol like SMIME, IPsec, IKE. So if you clarify that you're talking only about TLS explicitly, I think that Utah Working Group is a suitable home for this draft.
Sure. I mean, I just assume that, when you post a draft, people read the draft and what it updates. So, but anyhow, yes, use the SAN field for TLS authentication and putting it in the abstract. Sure, absolutely.
Oh, it's me? Yeah, I really like this. I think that we should do it. I think it could probably be done as AD sponsored. You probably need to sync up with CAB Forum. The existing specs, the CAB Forum EV, and I suspect the DV guidelines already say that you shouldn't be populating the CN field. You should only be doing subject alt name at this point. And I think that we obsoleted it back in '97. So I think it's highly unlikely that there's anything out there in TLS land, certainly nothing that's a browser that is using this capability. And anything that is probably using a set of roots that is just so old that it's not necessary to consider it either. Most of the roots are expired. So I think you can go ahead.
I think Ryan Sleevey read it, and I took him as the CAB Forum rep. So they're fine with that, at least unofficially. But yes, I'll have someone forward it to their mailing list.
It's also a question of we need the CAB Forum to then say, be consistent with this new RFC that's come out, because they've actually got the power to stop every CA from doing this stuff.
Right. Ryan has said he'll do that.
Right.
Bring that forward.
Bob?
Okay. I kind of like this draft, but in practicality, using subject alt name with OpenSSL was extremely hard on the command line form. Rich, you know what I did some years ago when I worked on this, my drafts, what it took to use this. Maybe this will be pushed back to the OpenSSL people to make it easier to make certs that have subject alt name and don't have common name. Because yes, there are products which do this, but trying to use the OpenSSL toolkit command line, it was hard. And I think it still is hard. Is there anything we should be doing about this?
It was hard. It isn't. There is a, I forget what the command line flag is, but you can just specify the SAN field on there, and some of the docs could be updated.
Okay.
And DKG, I'm no longer part of the OpenSSL team, and soon to be no longer part of the project.
I will go back to my draft and I'll give some things some try to see what has been updated and see if I can do things better than I did when I created that draft, now 2 years ago?
Yeah, I remember looking at it then, and I would certainly probably do a pull request to enforce this, when it gets published.
Before it gets published. So let's have it working before it gets published. Thank you.
Hi, Rich. I like this document, but I am not sure that the lack of reference to current C browser forum recommendation is reasonable. As far as I remember, it's a current practice of C browser forum, and I think this reference could be useful. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I just didn't have the time to look up what the reference would be. But yes, if you have one, Dimitri, mail me. Otherwise, I'll dig it up.
I
looked it up. It's good.
I don't remember the exact reference, but it's definitely present. Thank you.
Watson?
Hi, Watson Lad, Cloudflare. I like this draft. I think some of the nits that people are raising in chat is stuff that we can just kick over to UTA along with this draft. I think and it shouldn't be too hard to get this out pretty quickly. It's already in pretty good shape.
Thanks. And I think my comments are going to be along the same lines. I think this makes a lot of sense in the context of the TLS PKI, Web PKI. It might not make sense in other PKIs, like DKG pointed out. So I think kicking this back to Utah makes a lot of sense. DKG?
Just wanted to voice support for putting it in UTA, since I would just put that in the chat. I want to say it out loud. And I also wanted to clarify, there's been a little bit of discussion here as though this is somehow constraining the CAs. And it doesn't look to me like it is. It is constraining the verifiers. And I don't think we should let ourselves get mixed up by that. What we're saying is when you're verifying, don't look at this thing. And obviously that will have a downstream impact on what the CAs do. But I think it should be very clear that we are talking about how the verification stack works, not the issuance stack.
So I think there actually is a provision in the document that constrains CAs. That's certainly something that the working group could iterate on.
Yeah, the working group, DKG is right. It's about verification. And there's like a paragraph that says, and if the CA needs to do it, put a CN field. Don't make it look like a name. Don't make it look like a DNS name. But sure. I mean, we've been backwardly compatibly doing CN and equivalent SAN fields for 10 years. So let's just stop.
All right, Hannes, anything last comments here?
Yeah, I agree with the UTA place. And Ricky, if you can post a link to the document about how to do the configuration with OpenSSL, if it's not so easily findable, that would be really helpful, because the guys I've been working with have been struggling with this as well in the IoT context for device certificates.
Yeah, it's probably only in the latest master or 111, but I'll take a look and post it to this mailing list, I guess, Hannes.
All right, so we're through our queue. It sounds like we've got pretty good agreement here to shift this back to Utah, however we pronounce it. So we'll consider that to be the dispatch outcome. Last call for objections to that. All right, seeing no one leaping to the mic, let it be so decided. Thanks for the presentation, Rich.
Sure. Now, does UTA then do a call for adoption, or do I just post it there, or how's that work? I'll speak to the chairs, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the working group chairs are online. You might want to just talk with them about how to do that and how to accept that dispatch result.
Okay. And I see some advice in the chat. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Is Russ Housley here? I think he's our last topic for the day.
Hi, thank you. This is some joint work that I did with Carl Wallace. Next slide. The ERS, or evidence record syntax, is in RFC 4998. It was produced by the LTANS working group a long time ago. It includes two ASN1 modules, one using an old syntax from 1988 and other from the newer syntax that is the one that is still being maintained and enhanced in the ITU. This document provides an alternate ASN1 module that follows the conventions that were established by Jim Schad in RFC 5911 and 5912. Next slide, please. In addition, LTANS produced RFC 5276, and in that RFC they only provided one ASN1 module that used the older syntax. So this document provides one that is using the newer syntax as well as following the conventions from
we lost Russ.
I'm really glad to see that auto reconnect thing. So glad Mitaco put that auto reconnect in. I was like, oh no, now what? Okay, I'm back. Also provides these two, follows those conventions from Jim Schad's RFCs 5911, 5912. Next slide. So these new modules, basically the original ones had imports that included definitions from some places that are difficult to find. These alternate modules import everything from modules that are in RFCs, and they are bit for bit compatible with what comes out, with the ones that are in the RFCs, and these we propose would be informative so that the ones in the original specifications remain normative. Next slide. So implementers have found 5911, 5912 very useful. We're just trying to bring forward those things that implementers have found useful to the ERS specification as well. And then my last slide. And so we just recommend that these become informational RFCs, and since it's one document, we just thought the easiest thing to do is have it AD sponsored. And I'd like to hear what people think.
Any comments from the floor? Bill?
I think we should do it.
Now, Phil, you disappeared too quickly. Like, how do you think we should do it? Should we have a working group, AD sponsor, or what?
I think it should be AD sponsored. I mean, like, this is cleanup stuff. From what I gather, we're not expanding semantics or whatever. It's a clarification of the documentation. So
Thanks.
I think it's the sort of thing that, you know, informational is fine, AD sponsored, this is what it's for.
And for what it's worth, that was my analysis as well. This is a straightforward piece of work. Doesn't need a whole lot of technical broad review, so it made sense as AD sponsored. Roman, and as AD, you have a comment here?
Not so familiar with the ERS ecosystem. Could you give me a better sense of what we're using it for now and a little bit of a sense of the implementers we're helping?
Sure. So I have been making open source contributions to the Pi ASN1 module library. And so this was one of the specifications that was missing, and I found I had to do this in order to implement that. That's how this happened. And I found some other implementations in GitHub that I was able to pull test data from. So I'm pretty sure that the bits on the wire line up. And so I don't know who else would be using it, but that's how this happened.
Jonathan?
Jonathan?
Yeah, just I got my question. This only changes the definition of it, not the bits on the wire remain unchanged.
That is correct.
That makes it a lot easier to, you know, go with, I guess.
Yes, I was careful to make no semantic or syntactic changes to the bits on the wire.
So it seems to me like it would be good if we could have someone review to verify that that's the case sometime during last call, but it doesn't seem like we need much more than last call for that. All right, unless there are further comments or objections in this course of action, I think we'll declare a recommendation for AD sponsorship as our dispatch outcome here. Anyone want to jump to the mic and wave their hands in opposition?
All right, thanks for your time.
Seeing no one jumping in. Thank you, Russ. Roman?
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on that. Ben and I have kind of talked about it, and I've looked at the draft. I'll pick it up.
All right, thank you. That brings us to our AOB time. We have almost precisely as much, even a bit more than we had predicted. Are there any other AOBs that folks would like to bring up for this meeting? Hearing none, we will go ahead and proceed to the chair's sum up. Let me try and do this from memory, and if someone can correct me if they've got better notes. So for Oblivious HTTP, I think we agreed to spin up a small working group for that, and the charter will be workshopped on the SecDispatch mailing list. We'll figure out what the precise scope is there. And kick that over to the ADs for last call, for its review cycles and whatnot. For the CIPHERTEXT format, the decision there was that it needed some more discussion to clarify the requirements vis-a-vis the existing formats and to clarify who the constituency is that for whom this matters, and make sure it gets some uptake. So more discussion on SecDispatch list.
I think we said the new mailing list for this.
Okay, new mailing list. So yeah, please contact the ADs for your mailing list.
Yeah.
On the use of SAN, that got dispatched back to UTA. That was an easy one. And finally, the ASN1 module is going to be AD sponsored by Roman. There's our outcomes. Good job being decisional, folks. And with that, I think we're at the end. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks. Yes, and thanks again, Francesca, and welcome, Mohit.
Thank you. Thanks, our minute takers as well.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.